welcome to Get Your Bell Rung Pro Wrestling Podcast. Guys, I have a treat for you guys tonight. I have a gentleman who has been in the ring with the who's who. People like Mark Callis, the future Undertaker, of course, Kevin Sullivan, Abdullah the Butcher, and a gentleman who's involved with Twisted Wrestling Alliance. Matter of fact, he just recently hijacked the Men's Florida Championship belt in August. Sure, we'll be talking about that. A gentleman who has written a book of his autobiography called Looking Up at the Lights, which includes childhood stories and as well as talking about his time in WCW. I am, of course, talking about Robbie Idol. How are you, my friend?
I am good. How you doing, KG?
And you know what? I'm fresh off of a wonderful trip. I'm relaxed. I'm doing good. Can't complain.
Good.
My favorite time of the year as well. So, doing excellent, my man.
Good.
Let's get right on into it. I want to talk about your book.
Okay.
Before we get into anything else, tell me about your book. Again, fans, it's called Looking Up at the Lights. Highly recommend you guys getting this book. What made you wake up one morning and say, you know what? I want to write a book.
I've always wanted to write a book. We had, like when we all traveled together, I traveled with Bob Cook and Rick Ryder, Paul Drake, and you'd kind of talk about after time in wrestling and stuff like that, and had talked about it. I actually had that name of the book way back in 89 or 90.
Wow.
So I had talked to some people, just the right time, like one person I had approached kind of put me off. Another guy had spoke to, couldn't afford him. He was a big time publisher and just could not afford him. And then I came across the right person, said, here's what we'll do is I'm not writing anything for you. You write it. I will edit it. I will correct the spelling and stuff like that, but you just write it. You send me and give me 10 chapters. So I just sat down and started writing, and he corrected stuff. And what was funny was, because he had wrote like about 30 books, he was like, I thought I was horrendous. He goes, you're horrendous. And the first couple of chapters was funny because he goes, look, you got to try to break these down in paragraphs, not one long sentence. So, and it was funny because I saw my, she actually works in a grocery store now, but she was my junior high English teacher. And I told her, I said, I should have paid attention in school, and told her I was writing a book, and she got a kick out of it.
Yeah, I love writing as well. And I've thought about writing a book, but I can imagine how much work goes into it. And on top of that, when you're writing an autobiography the way you have, you are really opening yourself up to the world, saying, hey, this is me. Was there any struggles while writing your book about getting too personal about your life for the world to basically see?
Not really. I mean, I guess we can give a little bit away. Basically the only thing I kept out of respect to my wife, we kept the women out. I joked with a few of my friends. They said, because they all, said, what about like, your wild nights and stuff like that? I said, and was jokingly, I said, you'd probably forget a couple one night stands, and they'd read the book and they'd come back at you, screaming at you that you forgot to put them in your book. I was joking about that. The other stuff, no, that to open up, let's, about the steroids, about alcohol, about painkillers and stuff like that wasn't tough, to show, like not being the big star, but trying to get to that stardom. When I was approached to get into professional wrestling by Rick Ryder, who trained me, I asked him, what is it going to take? And he told me, you teach me how to lift weights and I'll show you how to wrestle. because I was training for Mr. Florida, and I was training with a buddy of mine that had qualified for Mr. America. And so, I was getting ready, and I had kind of started getting burnt out on the bodybuilding scene, and had approached somebody that was in Florida Championship Wrestling at one time and asked, how do I go about getting into wrestling? And at the time I was like 190 pounds, and he looked at me and just said, "You're not big enough, and I don't think you have what it takes to get into professional wrestling." Bottom line is, it was funny because I was that skinny little kid, in sports and stuff growing up, and always got doubted. Like when I started working out, I kind of gravitated to the bodybuilders. They accepted me, and then just started training really hard. They taught me when the way I got into lifting weights. I had gotten released. I had a tryout with the Blue Jays, and I was there for a couple weeks, and I got released. When I came home, I was like, what am I going to do now? Because the goal all through life was, I always thought I was playing pro ball. So when I got released from the Blue Jays, it was now what? And I had a couple scholarships. They weren't big schools. They were, I guess, Division III schools. So one was to go back home to UB, University of Buffalo, and the other one was Florida A&M. Basically didn't really know. I knew a couple of my aunts and uncles that lived in Buffalo, but really wasn't close to them and didn't really know my family. And plus I didn't want to deal with the winters in Buffalo. So I thought, well, let's talk to Coach Hubbard and see if I can maybe, try to walk on and play at Florida A&M. And I had talked to him. And at the time when I played in high school and stuff, I was a safety, and I told him I wanted to play fullback. And he goes, "How much do you weigh?" And I told him 185 pounds. And he said, my fullbacks are 215. And I was like, "Coach, I'll be 215. And, I just thought you lifted weights. I didn't realize you had to eat like a horse to get, put weight on too. So when I got to lifting weights, I actually enjoyed lifting weights. And got in with the bodybuilders, got in with a few guys that were doing really well in the bodybuilding competitions. And they taught me, you do have to eat. So, I kind of just walked away from playing football. It wasn't, I was like, do I want to go to school? And I was going, if I would have if I went to school, I was going to school for the wrong reasons. I was going to school to play sports. I wasn't going to school to learn, So, I was just one of those guys that was goal oriented. You had this in your head, and that's what you're going to do. Now, you never thought, hey, I'm going to fail. So,
well, the first gentleman that told you that you were too small, that he didn't think you would ever make it in professional wrestling, was that something that really got under your skin and really motivated you to absolutely make it? Because I know when I'm told I can't do something, I'm going to do it just in spite.
Right. Well, the bad part was, and I can tell you who it is, and it's in the book. And it was funny because it was Jay Goodley. He was the ring announcer for Florida Championship Wrestling. He just said he didn't think I had what it takes to make it in there. Didn't kind of know my background. Didn't know who I was. He knew me from the gym, but that was basically it. The bad part was, you were talking back then with no internet, no all the access we have today. So I didn't know Malenko had a school in Tampa. So I really kind of let it go by the wayside at the time. But you had it when Rick approached me on it. That by that time, I went from like 190 when I started training with my buddy for Mr. Florida. I wound up going from 190 and I wound up going to 250. So, he was like 5'6", 235 and bulking up for Mr. America. So I just, once he had the whole thing mapped out because he had the diet and everything else. And I was just kind of following him. So, we went through the bulk up phase and we power lifted. So, I was putting up some decent numbers with decent weights and stuff. So I trained hard, to get where I was.
How long were you training before you decided that you really were going to pursue professional wrestling? How did all that come about?
Well, with Rick, it was funny because Rick and Bob actually worked out not a lot in our gym, but you would see them from time to time. So this one day I poked my buddy and said, hey, so, I still watched wrestling because I grew up on it. I poked my buddy and said, hey, it's those guys from Florida Championship Wrestling. And when Rick looked over and I nodded to Rick, and that's when he came over and asked me about, hey, when you guys going to learn how to wrestle? Well, Bob, his goal was to Mr. America. Me, I was kind of getting, like I said, burnt out on bodybuilding. I enjoyed training, but I was just kind of burnt out on the dieting, the bodybuilding. And that's so when I asked Rick, I go, when I asked him and he said, you teach me how to lift and I'll teach you how to train. I was like, when do we start? And I want to say when I met him, it was like the middle of the week. He goes, how's Monday? So that Monday we started training. So we were in the gym on Monday. We were at a wrestling ring on Tuesday.
Wow.
So I started, the following week, and it was funny because Rick was wrestling in the, for Florida Championship Wrestling and in the independents. And he wrestled, it was a, little town in Florida called Mulberry. And he was telling the guy, hey, I just started training this guy. He was getting ready for Mr. Florida and stuff. And he said, the gentleman's name was John Davenport. And he was like, bring him. So I wound up meeting him, I trained for a couple days or whatever, and I wound up going that Sunday. And John was like, bring your stuff next Sunday, you're wrestling. And I'm like, no, I'm not. I'm not even ready. And he goes, oh, you'll be fine. I'll put you with Rick and you'll be fine. And I'm like, no. And he goes, no, I'll see you next week. And he wound up, so now you're trying to, cram stuff in, training wrestling only, practicing 2 days a week. And it was crazy. I mean, the match completely sucked with Rick, but I think what was even worse than the match was whoever taped the match. Thank God that they sucked even worse than the match, because you would see the ground, you would see that. So you missed a lot of spots and stuff, but it was a good learning experience, and you got thrown in the fire. So, it was like, I think John saw, okay, I got another big guy now. So he had a couple big guys there at the time, and it was like, okay, I got another guy, and I'll just throw him in the mix with it. So it was like one of those learning on the job sites.
Talk to me about.
Go ahead. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to.
No, you're fine. Talk to me about your training, because one thing that has really, since I've been doing this, amazes me about professional wrestling is everyone that I talk to, when it comes to talking about their training, it's always different. No one has the same story about training.
Okay.
Tell me about your training and how hard was it on you?
It wasn't, if that makes sense. Part of it was because of having the athletic background. Some of this, the hardest thing for me out of all of it was learning how to take a bump. I could not, when I was supposed to kick my feet out, I would roll on my ass. Just could not do it. And that pissed Rick off. I mean, it was funny. You would do that trying to take a bump and could not. And he just, after, 3 or 4 training sessions, still didn't know how to do it. Pick the move, I was picking the moves up and stuff. Just had a hell of a time doing that. And that kind of pissed him off. It was, you knew you were kind of walking on thin ice with it. But what was funny, how I learned how to do it, and I talk about it in the book, but an ex-girlfriend, I was living with her. we threw the mattress on the floor, and I showed her how to hit me with a clothesline so she wouldn't, remember the times I pissed her off that she tried to hit you in the face or something. So she would hit me in the chest with a clothesline, and I tried to get my feet, and I'd tell her to kind of hit it hard, to kind of sweep it. And I started learning how to kick my feet out from there. So I actually went home after a training session and just had her hit me time after time with a clothesline. So I'd learned how to kick my feet out and finally learned it, but it took a while. Yeah. But basically, Rick, he ran you through the basics, some of the basics, your basic moves, your how to chain wrestle, some, not a lot. So I didn't learn, like, say, had I gone to Malenko's school where I knew he worked, they worked on a lot of the chain wrestling and stuff like that. So Rick showed me that. Rick showed me how to, the run the ropes, to take the bumps, stuff like that. And a lot of it is I learned, because I got thrusted in there so soon.
Right.
So I kind of learned on the job too with it.
Yeah. You mentioned about taking a bump. So people, and it doesn't matter if you're a wrestling fan or not. A lot of people, when they think about professional wrestling, they think, oh, all these guys have to do is play fight and then fall down. Mm-hmm. They don't realize the arts there is in professional wrestling with actually taking a bump, because Baby Doll, who I had on my show a long time last year, she was talking about that. And she was saying one of the reasons why she was more of a valet than her getting in the ring was because she couldn't figure out how to take the bump, because when you fall, you have your natural instincts. Mm-hmm. But when you're taking a bump, you have to go away from those natural instincts. So is that, whenever you say that you're struggling, was it because of, that's basically what it was, is your natural instincts? Oh shit, I'm falling, so I need to protect myself this way. But you actually had to train yourself not to think that way.
It was so long ago now to be truthful, but I mean, it was just hard to kick your feet out in the beginning,
right?
To realize, okay, that's how you do it. Land on your back. Once you got it, it was okay. Now I see what's happening. But like I said, it didn't click right away. And usually it was when we trained, was just Rick and I. So we didn't have, like, say, okay, like I've gone, like throughout the years, I've trained some people and stuff like that. And you have like 2 or 3 of you. So if somebody has a hard time trying to learn how to take a bump, you set somebody behind them on all fours and push them over them to show them how to try to kick your feet out. Sometimes it works with people, sometimes it doesn't, because the same thing, like you're saying, that natural, your instincts try to take over how to land, to try to protect yourself. Once you get it and you do it repeatedly, it kind of comes second nature and stuff.
Right.
But it does take a while, But I mean, yeah, it's funny because even like my training partner that was getting ready for it thought, oh, it's easy. And I said, it's not, it's more difficult than you think it is.
Right. What is the difference today between training now versus your training back in the day when you were training?
What do you mean by that?
Well, do you think that the people today, they have it easier as far as the training regimen versus the training back in the 70s and 80s?
I don't think so. I mean, it's funny because I haven't talked to Bob about it, but I've talked to Rick and I've talked to Bob's son, Robbie, and one of the other guys that Bob had trained, Big Robert, and even a couple of my friends. It's not training, but let's say the tryouts. Like I've just, talked and said, if you had to go through the tryouts today, seeing how, seeing the show. So who knows if it's made for TV like that or not? You don't know because you're not behind the scenes there. But if it's what you're seeing on TV, like, where they've pulled 300 people and saying, okay, we're going to watch how you roll and you do this. He said, I don't know that I'd have made it in today's world just from the tryout.
Right.
The training, I think it's hard to say because not being back there with them to see how they're doing their training. I don't know. I mean, I would think it's got to be difficult the whole way through because there is stuff to try to learn, and I think I'll give today's a little bit harder because you have more high flyers of today than you did back in the day. So I'd say maybe today because of the high flying and stuff like that.
Right. Yeah. One reason why I thought maybe the answer would be opposite, that it was a bit easier, was because of, as things tend to move on forward over the years, people that pave the way also find better ways for others to learn that's not as hard for them as it was, say, for you back in the day. Because some people who I've talked to who went to wrestling school in the past 5 or 6 years have said the opposite, that they didn't think that they could make it back in the day in wrestling school because it was more brutal back then versus now. So,
yeah, I mean, it's like, but here's the hard for me to compare because I really didn't go to a wrestling school. I mean, I had like one-on-one with Rick. I was just like Rick's whatever protege, somebody. He decided, hey, I'm going to train you. So me training with Rick is completely different than me going to a school, like saying me go to Malenko's or something like that. I don't know if I ever went to Malenko's school. Because by that time Bob was, because the people I hung out with mostly, because Bob was here, he had a hand in training Rick a little bit and stuff like that. So like the three of us were pretty much all together a lot. I mean, I remember doing shows for the great Malenko, and because I was with Bob, and Bob, I guess I was good friends with Bob. Boris was very good to me. I was very appreciative of that. Like if I was sitting by him, like at a show before it started or something, he would talk to me like I was one of his students. So, and he would give me a philosophy or, like kind of to think your way through a match and stuff like that. So he did treat me like, I had trained with him.
Right.
So, and I was very grateful for that, and thankful. And I guess that was part of just being with Bob. And it, and you just paid attention and you tried to incorporate it, so you'd have, so you had other people giving you input, which helped. I mean, but as far as like a school, it's hard for me to compare because I was like one-on-one with Rick, and my training was probably so different than everybody else's, Now
you said that, you showed up with to work with Rick. Pretty quickly, they threw you in a match that you described as terrible. How long was it before? How long was it before you had your next match, and how did that match go?
I probably was, once he did that first match, he probably just kept using me every Sunday. And you try, it was kind of crash course going through there with practices and stuff. Like I said, it was like learning on the job. I want to say it took me with the crash course and stuff, probably a little over a month where you started getting comfortable with stuff.
Were you getting, I've watched a couple of other interviews with you, and I could be wrong, but it sounds like you could be a little bit of a perfectionist. And so being that, that you are that guy, that you want to do things right, you hold yourself to a higher standard. That's the impression I got from you. Were you getting frustrated being that you were being thrown in these matches and they weren't good at first?
Not Not really. I mean, it made you work harder to, you know, improve. Like, I know you said you read a little bit of the book, and I'm probably giving some stuff away. There was, like, growing up in there, he was my dad. He's the only dad I know. But he was my stepdad. You could never do nothing right in his eyes. So you always, didn't matter. Like, let's say you mowed the lawn, you cut it too short, you cut it too high. From the time I was 12 to the time I was 16, those 4 years with him, because I wound up leaving at 16. After my mom passed shortly, I left and just bounced from home to home to get through high school. It wasn't your cuddly moments with, like, your dads, or, you had some stepdads were good. And when I say this, it's, and it was the drive. So you tried to push yourself to, like you said, that perfection, because it was always, I'll prove you wrong. But there was always that little bit of doubt in yourself. And it was like, if it wasn't every day, it was every other day. And you always heard you would never amount to an effing thing in this world from him.
Right.
So that made you push yourself, like, okay, this is, when I played ball, you pushed yourself like, I'm going to make it. But there was always that little bit of doubt, just because you kind of heard the voices in the back of your head through that.
Right.
Fans,
but real quick, fans, by the way, Robbie just mentioned that, I didn't read his book yet. Robbie sent me his book, and unfortunately I didn't get it until right before we left for our vacation.
And that wasn't a knock on you. That wasn't a knock. I'm sorry.
I don't want fans to think that your book, here I have guys having you on, and I didn't read your book. Like, why not?
Right.
The few pages I did read, very good. I will finish this book, and actually I'm going to have Robbie back on once I finish the book. Again, my wife and I drove cross country and got the book right before we were leaving. But get this book, guys, because again, the few pages I read, it's already very, very good. Do you remember the match that you had that you were like, holy crap, I got this. I'm good at this?
It probably came later in my career. There were a few matches, and like one of them was a 6-man steel cage in the Indies, it was Rick Ryder, Bob Cook, and Tom Horn versus myself, Jeff Jarrett, and Jack Corbin. That match, I went through that, and then maybe a year or two after that, Rick and I had a match in Lemon Bay High School, and that one, like, it was an all-out brawl. It was a bloodbath. It was that, and I want to say, was that match before? That match was before. And just a few other matches I had, like, we did a run with him because Rick had trained him a little bit. Mark Merrow, who went on to be Johnny B. Bad and back to Mark Merrow. But in the Indies, when he very first started, I actually wrestled him his first match, and then did a little bit because I was Rick's champion. So I did a title run with Mark, and then I dropped it to him, in there, and we did a couple, like 3 or 4 matches. And some of the matches, and it was funny because Mark was athletic, and he was easy to work with. and you had those kind of matches, the athletic matches and stuff like that where you worked and stuff like that. So yeah, so I want to say probably from somewhere from like 88 to 89, you were like, hey, I'm this, I started in 85, but it took a few years and stuff like that where, yes, you were like, I do belong in this sport, and I'm holding my own.
Right. You mentioned some names when you were answering that question. You put a smile on my face because you literally made my childhood come across my mind. And you mentioned a name by Horn, Tim Horn, right?
No, Tom Horn.
Tom Horn.
Tom Horn. He never wrestled like for Florida Championship Wrestling or WCW. He trained people. He was actually a sheriff. Mm-hmm. And he wrestled in the independents, and the guy he wrestled, and he's like wrestled for NWA. He was their champion and stuff. Kahingis. So he trained Kahingis. And so Tom never really tried to pursue going to Florida Championship Wrestling or anything because he was a sheriff.
Now, I'm pretty sure, was there a Tim Horn in the business?
Tim Horner,
that's it. That's what I was thinking of when you mentioned that. He was one of the most underrated wrestlers, in my opinion, that I watched as a child. I grew up watching NWA, Mid-South, Bill Watts, from Louisiana. So when you mentioned that name, that's what my brain.
Well, it's in the book, but a funny story about him. So one night in Lakeland, remember when him and Brad Armstrong were tag team champions?
Yes.
Yeah. So Tim had missed his flight to Lakeland. And so Dusty came up to me and goes, "Kid, here's your big break. We're going to see what you got." And he put me with Brad against the Sheep Herders and Johnny Ace. And so I got to take Tim's place in there. And it was funny, afterwards when we walked in the back, I just went out and was like, okay, cool. Maybe I'm going to get to move up the card, maybe get pushed to mid card or whatever. And went out and gave like 120%. And, as we got into the dressing room, Dusty looked at Brad and goes, "How'd the kid do?" So he didn't even go out and watch.
Now, you mentioned the Sheep Herders. Now, for the younger fans, you may recognize the name more Bushwhackers.
Right.
The Sheep Herders, back before they got what I call WWE-nized, before WWE got their hands on them, they were a very violent tag team. These guys would beat the piss out of their opponents. Was that one of these matches that you guys had to endure the true Sheep Herders, where they beat the tar out of you?
No, we actually, we got, well, because Brad was champion. I did, they went over. I was the guy that took the fall. But they actually gave me a lot of offense in that match.
Wow.
So they let me work. They let me do, they let me work and kind of showcase what I had and stuff like that. And it was actually a very fun match. It was, that I got to work with them was an honor to work with them, and they were easy to work with, very easy. It was funny. They had thrown me out of the ring during the match. And as I went to stand up, Johnny hit me with the flag, and I went flying out into the people in the front row, and Johnny's trying to grab me by my feet so I wouldn't go into the crowd and stuff like that. But they gave me offense. They let me show I could work. So they were good to work with.
How long were you on the indie scene before you got that call up to go to WCW? Tell me, how did you get that call up? Walk me through that.
Okay, so here's how what happened is, I'll kind of give you a walkthrough. So Rick had trained me. I was working in the independents, and Rick and Bob didn't really in the beginning wrestle with us in the independents that much. So we were, Rick would always go, "Hey, I'll try to get you a tryout." And we were wrestling for Florida Championship. He was wrestling for Florida Championship Wrestling. And he goes, "When I think you're ready, I'll get you a tryout for Florida Championship Wrestling. And so as you kind of, through the indies, kind of saw, okay, I'm improving and I'm kind of learning this and I'm getting the hang of this. And the one name I had mentioned, Jack Corbin. So I actually, once I started getting better, I started working against Jack. And that helped a lot too, getting to work with other people, but Jack was also very helpful. And so we would have actually had some very good matches. So Jack went to Davenport and said, hey, I want him as my tag team partner. So I got to be, his tag team partner and stuff like that. So I want to say it had to be, which is crazy, but it had to be like a month and a half of me, Rick training me and then me getting thrusted in there. It was funny how it came about. So it was in May and Rick goes, hey, bring your gear. I'll bring you to TV and you can watch tape, you can hang out during taping and see how it works and everything. And then we'll go to the ring up in Tampa and we'll work out. So we get about 2 blocks from the Sportatorium in Tampa and Rick goes, forgot to tell you, you're getting a tryout. This is your tryout. So make sure you bring your gear with you. And he goes, happy birthday, because my birthday was like in a couple of days. So he got me the tryout. So I got the tryout in Florida Championship Wrestling. So I wound up, they put me with Rick, which was, eased your nerves a little bit. And then I wrestled, we wound up working Dave Sierra or Fidel Castro and Ricky Santana. And so it went well that they started they brought me back on TV and stuff. So I wound up working for WCW, or not WCW, Florida Championship Wrestling for the time that they were here in Florida before Crockett bought them out. So when Crockett bought them out, when they were buying territories, so I want to say what was like an 87 or something.
Mm-hmm.
I want to say 87. And so what they did was they pulled their stars, like all the, enhancement guys or guys that weren't their stars. Now you're kind of left, what am I doing? So I wound up, stayed in the indies and stuff. Then I think in 88 or had to be beginning of 88, Mike Graham and Steve Kern decided they were going to start Florida Championship Wrestling up again. So wound up getting a call and said, hey, we're going to have a big meeting, in like a couple weeks or whatever. And Rick and Bob had gotten the call and everything. So we all went up to Tampa and they were like, we're going to start Florida Championship Wrestling again. And this is what we're going to do. And everybody's going to be a star. And this, and this is how we're going to push it and stuff. So was there and did that. And halfway through, they were using me, but you weren't getting the push, or you didn't think you were getting the push that, like kind of seeing guys come in, newer guys come in and, kind of getting pushed to the spotlights and stuff. So I don't know how I had Kevin or how I attained Kevin's number, Kevin Sullivan. Yeah. So I called Kevin and asked him and said, hey, what would it take to get to WCW? And Kevin said, you and Rick come up and do TV and let's see how you guys do. And we'll go from there. And so Rick and I actually loaded up and drove to Atlanta, early enough to get to TV, did TV and drove back home from there. So it was like a 24-hour, straight. And, it was easy the first match because we wound up wrestling the New Breed, Sean Royal and Chris Champion, and we had worked them in Florida before. So that was made it easy. So they started using us on TV, every week, and we just started doing that. And then all of a sudden they started using us on house shows and stuff like that. So that was kind of how that took off to get to WCW. It was just because I had made a call to Kevin, and Kevin said, well, I'll give you a shot and see what you and Rick got, and we'll go from there.
Let's talk about Kevin Sullivan for a second. this is my personal opinion, I don't think he gets the credit that he deserves. I think Kevin Sullivan was literally had a mind of a genius when it came to professional wrestling. Again, that's just my opinion.
Right.
What's your relationship like with Kevin Sullivan? And do you agree with that statement that he had a brilliant mind when it came to professional wrestling?
Yes. It's funny how I had met Kevin, and again, talks about it in the book. I actually, like I said, was a fan of wrestling. So while I was working out, I would go to Robarts when they'd come into town. And so I kind of, during some of the matches, I would kind of go back and hang out at the locker room and see. So I had saw Kevin, and I knew he had, bodybuilded, power lifted, just from them talking on Florida Championship Wrestling. So I had talked to him about working out and stuff. And I approached him about, I knew where he was working out in Tampa because I knew the owner of the gym. He had competed in the AAU bodybuilding, but I knew him through my training partner. So I had said something to him about, maybe coming up and working out with him. So I went up and worked out with him one day, but never, I didn't want him I didn't want to ask him how to get into professional wrestling, thinking, okay, this is why this guy, came and asked me about working out. So I just went to work out with him, and I left it at that, never asked him about any of the other stuff, and just worked out with him. And I hung with him, and everything. And that I kind of had like a little bit of a relationship with him. So then when I had the tryout, when Rick brought me to Florida Championship Wrestling, I guess Kevin was, because I guess that was after Eddie had passed away. Kevin, I guess, maybe they had him part of the bookers with Mike and stuff like that. So I think part of that, I think Kevin remembered me, and I guess I did okay. So he kept me, and stuff like that. And I just would talk to Kevin when I had a chance, or, didn't hang out with him, but would talk to him and had a relationship with him. Not a close one, but closer than, say, some of the other ones. And I always liked Kevin. And I mean, like you said, the mind for it, and like when he was in the Florida run where he did the dark side stuff, I thought that was like awesome. That just, I always thought that was really cool how he had did that.
Right.
Just, how it came off, so believable and stuff like that. And just the crazy stuff they did. I thought it was neat. I had that dark side to me anyway. So I always thought it was like really cool. It was funny. I won't mention some of the stars' names, but I know like when I was in WCW and, they put the list up who you were working with on TV. And if a couple of the big names had to work them, they did not like working with them. Yeah, because Kevin, I didn't bother me because you just knew certain guys. Like a lot of guys didn't like working with Buzz Sawyer, and I didn't mind working with Buzz. Even they worked a little snug. You just knew, okay, it's going to be a little snug tonight, and you knew that, But like at times when I like in the Indies with Rick, when I worked with Rick, there would be times, you'd get stuff got out of hand, and you knew it wasn't on purpose, and you knew it's just part of the business. You're going to take it and stuff, and
yeah, I was a huge Buzz Sawyer fan. He had a reputation that I found out years later, but it doesn't change my memories of Buzz Sawyer. But I want to talk about, so you've been in the ring with Mark Callis. Before he was the Undertaker. Could you even imagine that Mark would become the massive star that he did become? I mean, was he that good in the ring just yet when you faced him?
He was good. He was that was actually the time I worked him, was his very first TV taping match. So I had worked him. when I saw the size of the guy, I was a little leery. You're like, oh shit, you know. But he was very easy to work with. The only thing that was funny, and it really didn't affect me, the end when he did the elbow off, when he walked the rope and come off with the elbow, he started to slip a little bit. And in the back afterwards, he was like, hey, sorry about that landing. He goes, it was either you or me. And I was like, you were fine. You know, it really wasn't that rough. So, but I mean, to see what he could do, like to walk the ropes and stuff like that, that was, you know, you were like, wow, to think that he was going to be that as big as he got. I don't know if you had like saw it or not, but you knew he was very talented for his, you know, his size and the stature and everything. He was very talented.
Right. Now, your time at WCW, do you think that you learned more as a professional wrestler in WCW, or do you think you learned more over, you know, the years in the indie scene or with Florida?
And it's nothing, it's not a knock on WCW, because I'm very grateful that I was there and my time. And I know I'm very fortunate to get there. Like, how many people wanted to get there and couldn't get there, or, you know, one and done, because you would see guys come in and it was like, you know, revolving door. So I'll say this for WCW, for the time I was there, before, you know, I was it wasn't by WCW's choice. It was what had happened to me that I was forced to leave. So, I mean, if that had not happened, I would have still been there for who knows how long. But you know, I was one of their top enhancement guys. So I'm very grateful and thankful for it. But as far as, say, learning and stuff, I'm going to say my time on the independent scene is where I actually got to learn.
Now, is it because, and please tell me if I'm wrong, but with WCW, I have to imagine, you know, as great as the talent was, and I've heard stories of talent, both WWE and WCW, taking time to work with the younger talent. At the same time, you're on national TV at this point. Everybody's trying to get their own careers going. Could that be one of the reasons why maybe, you know, you've learned more on the indie scene versus at WCW, where it's kind of the big times at that point?
Could have been. And I mean, like, again, I'm gonna make a comment here.
Mm-hmm.
And to, again, you know, it's probably gonna come off as, wow, he should be thankful he was there. And I am very thankful, to the big stars and stuff like that. I think the guys that they had in place were their stars. They drew money, and I just wasn't in the right place at the right time. Maybe just didn't have that right look that they wanted. You know, I can't say it was nothing, but I think it was kind of hard for, like, you know, the time I came up in WCW. It was kind of hard for a lot of guys to get that big push that were there. So think about, like, guys that were just mid cards, but you say, okay, wow, they were very talented and stuff. But you had like Tom Zink, Z-Man, Brian Pillman. Who else was kind of in that boat? Those guys were, you know, the Tim Horner, Brad Armstrong, guys that were very, very, you know, like Brad was one of the best, and he never really got that big push. So for, like, people like Rick, me, you know, I know Dusty gave Bob some chances, but, like, well, another guy, and I'll give you a great example in WCW, Mike Awesome. He was there when I was there, and they didn't do anything with Mike. You know, Mike, you know, they did the same thing. I think they saw, like, okay, these are the guys we're going to use as enhancement, or you want to go back to the term and say jobbers, and that's their job, and that's what it is. And, you know, that's how they kind of viewed us as, and didn't say, okay, let's see what they got. This is this is their place here, and this is how we're going to use them. Because I mean, when I had left, I kind of like didn't watch for a little bit, and all of a sudden, I wound up, when I was out, I coached my buddies' kids in like AAU baseball and stuff, and they all knew I wrestled and stuff. So like a little bit years later, they were like, "Coach, do you ever see ECW?" And I'm like, "No," and never heard of it. And and was funny because it was on at like 2:00 in the morning, and so I taped it. And I think like the first match or when I watched it in that time was Mike Awesome. And he, came over from Japan, and I'm like watching it. He was with Tanaka, and I'm like, this guy's great, like, wow, WCW never used him like this, and it was like, so, there's an example. And it was crazy, like when ECW folded and he went back to WCW, and they did the same thing. The new people that were there didn't know how to use Mike. They just didn't use him the right way. I mean, the guy, for as big as he was very talented,
Right.
So it was, I think they just had the mindset, these are what these guys are. And that's kind of, like I said, I mean, maybe some, like if a big star hears this or whatever and says, oh, he's a dick or he's an ass, because I'm not trying to badmouth anything. Like I said, I'm very grateful and everything for my time in WCW. And I'm, hey, I was, I got to be there and I was happy what I did. I'm just saying that there were just certain guys, they just didn't say, hey, let's see what you got.
Right. Well, I mean, it's true. I mean, WCW squandered some of the talents that they have. I mean, going back to talk about Mark Calloway, became one of the biggest legends in professional wrestling as The Undertaker. Same thing with Stone Cold Steve Austin.
Right.
You see him, right? So, I mean, what you're saying is more true than it is false. I mean, it's just, history has gone on to tell us these things, that they missed a lot of opportunities. A lot of guys have told me that wrestling is more mentally challenging than it is physically challenging. Has there been a time when, especially when you were with WCW, that you questioned, why am I still doing this?
No, not at all. I mean, you had to have, like, for me, you always thought, that it's just that being the right place, the right time, or that one big break, it's coming. You always thought it's around the corner. Like, right. Hey, okay, I've done my time. They'll say, hey, he's got, you always believe you get that one shot. That's how I felt. I can't speak for anybody else. I just always thought, maybe, when I'm at a house show, they'll see me with this guy and go, oh, wow, let's see, that looked pretty good. Let's see what he's got. Let's give him a shot, So I never like said, no, like that didn't wear on me, and it was, you were working and you didn't have to have a real job and stuff like that. But you always thought you're going to be that one, you get that one match that will kind of push you, maybe up the card a little bit, or, put you where you want it to be.
Right. Your favorite opponent?
My favorite opponent had to be Rick Ryder. I mean, just because Rick trained me, we, throughout the years that I worked with Rick, I want to say the only two bad matches Rick and I ever had was the very first one, and that was because of that. I actually came back in '99, and I was trying to go to ECW, and neither one of us, I think Rick did maybe a show here and there. I had like 8 years of ring rust on me, and we never worked out. So that match that I came back, that was a horrible match too. It had some good points to it, but it had some bad points to it. You could definitely tell it wasn't a Rick and Robbie match that we've had in the past. We had our moments, but we just didn't. It wasn't like a regular Rick and Robbie moment. But Rick was my.
Go ahead.
Okay, well, Rick was my favorite opponent.
Right.
But it's funny. So if you go to, I did 2 different eras. Okay, so I did that, and then when I came back in '99, and I pursued it, I'm very grateful for them, and that I came across them. They were at a match, and they wound up. He gave me his card and said, "Hey, I have a wrestling school, Billy Elvis Lindsay, and Billy, the father of Roderick Strong." Yep. So Billy had a wrestling school in Tampa, and he gave me his card. I wound up getting the guy, found out I was coming back, and wound up I wound up wrestling. And he said, "Hey, you guys," I wound up wrestling. I guess he had probably broke in when I broke in, Chris Proctor. And I wound up working him that night. And we had a good match which was crazy because I think Chris, he was still working, but I hadn't worked, but he was easy to work with, and we pulled it off, and everything went well. So Billy gave me his card, and I wound up working with Billy. So Billy it was Billy, and then he worked in AWA as TNT Mahoney, Tim Wirtz. And those two actually helped me to reinvent myself, where they trained me how to do stuff off the top ropes and how to adjust to the new style of wrestling. So like I had the 2 different eras. So if you go back and go into the second era, my favorite would have been Tim, TNT, because I worked out with him so much and I got to work with him. He was one of my favorites, and I had trained 2 kids when I came back with Billy, because Billy made me one of his instructors, and they were 2 young kids. They came from the backyard, and they were fun to work with, and their names I couldn't tell you their last names, but their first names were Michael and Garrett. And we did a lot of stuff in the beginning of when Billy started his organization, the RWA. They were fun. So those would be like my very all-time favorites, through the indies, because I worked out with them a lot. So you were very, very comfortable working with them.
Right. Did you ever pursue, through contacts or just sending information, to WWF/WWE?
I had one. Here's what happened, and I want to say it was '89. He was a manager in the Independence, and he went by Fitzy, Gene Bird. He got me a tryout with WWF in '89, and I wound up doing the tryout. It was like a taping on a Monday night, so I had went to the taping. I wound up working against Rick Rude, and easy match. It was funny though, when after the match I went to Rick and asked him, "Hey, how was everything? Everything okay?" His comment to me was, "You locked up stiff." So now I'm like, oh. But the biggest thing at that time with WWF was in '89, they were very unorganized. Like, you had to be there. I want to say I got there like at 7. I actually did not go on till 11:30 that night for that TV taping.
Wow.
So, I mean, you were sitting around. It was just, that was, and what was funny about that, because every other match I've ever had, no matter indies, WCW, Florida Championship Wrestling, even my, the comebacks years later and stuff like that, you always had that touch of nerves before the first move got out of the way. You always had that nerve. That night I was not nervous. I just wanted it to be done. You had, you're just hanging out, and it was just very unorganized. So when that had happened, I think he had asked me, do you want to do another TV taping or whatever? And I just, I said thanks, but no thanks. And I was just happy to go back to WCW.
Right. Talk to me about why you left WCW.
It was a medical condition. So I started having some issues, like I had loss of feeling in my hands, and it'll talk about it in the book and stuff like that. So you would have blurred vision, some slurred speech and stuff, but it would come and go. And I was supposed to do an indie show for Rick. He had this big indie show, and that morning I wound up waking up, and it was like being drunk, but intensifying it like times 10. So when I stood up, the whole room spun. Tried to get to the bathroom, you're bouncing off of walls and stuff, and you were sick and everything, and even trying to get back to bed. So you knew something was off. Wound up going to the hospital, the emergency room, and they went, you're low on fluids and stuff like that. So they gave me, I wound up taking 2 IV bags in there, and they kept me in there for a while. And so the same thing happened Sunday morning. Wound up back at the hospital, and the doctor goes, he's got vertigo. And so he gave me a prescription for it and stuff like that. It went away, and then it would come back, and I would try to hide, I wouldn't say anything to anybody. It just kind of got worse. So at the time, my ex-wife had worked for a doctor, and she told him, the symptoms and stuff. He knew a neurologist, and he got me in to see the neurologist. So I went on a Friday night, and they did the MRI and everything. So on Monday, when I went to the neurologist, I actually knew his office manager. So I had known her. And so like Monday, and it was like, I want to say 9:30 or something, and I had not heard from him, and I'm thinking, we got to know. And so I wound up calling her, called the office manager, and I was talking to her, and I said, what did you guys find out? And she said, he wants to see you and your wife this afternoon. So I went in, and, I had joked the whole weekend. And that was about that time with Lyle Alzado, having what he had and stuff like that. We went out to dinner Friday and Saturday with friends, and I was, joking about it, but in a way I was like scared about it going to happen. Saying, watch, he's going to tell me I got what Lyle Alzado has, and he's going to give me X amount of months or whatever. And, like my friends were like, don't talk like that and stuff like that. So when we went in, as we sat down, he goes, you have MS. I had heard of it, but I never, not having it or anything, you don't, pay attention to what it is or whatever. So when he said you have MS, I was like, can you fix it? He goes, there's no cure for it. So, you're kind of like, whatever. And, he talked to us for a little bit and stuff. And as we were leaving, I walked out, and he had kept my ex back a little bit. And I never found it out till years and years later. He had told her, he said, be ready. He'll be in a wheelchair in 6 months.
Wow.
So I never found that out till years later. So the first year, towards the end of the year, they wound up putting me on, I guess they had some stuff coming out, and I wound up doing like 2 days in a row an IV treatment. I think it was like beta seron or something like that. So I think it was like they hooked you up to an IV, and I want to say it was 3 to 6 hours, 2 days in a row. And I did pretty well the first year. I think towards the end, I had like the end of the year again, like I had an episode. And then the following year, they had came out with a new, like, I guess they were doing like experimental drugs or stuff. So they came out with a drug and it was called beta furon. And they wound up putting me on it. And I wound up doing well with it. So I want to say like in 94, I would go to work, I would work out, you kind of tried to lay low and everything like that. And then in 94, I ran into somebody in the grocery store and he was telling me about, he played in a men's league, a men's baseball league, and said, "Hey, are you interested?" And, at this time now I'm kind of getting antsy and I'm like, this isn't me being, kind of taking it easy and stuff. And so I said, yeah. So I wound up going and playing in the men's league and wound up doing that. I want to say I did that till like 98, played and wound up, played on the weekend. So I wound up playing, I'm in Venice, which people won't know, but like I played in Bradenton on a Saturday and I drove to Fort Myers on a Sunday and played. So I actually, wound up going back and I was catching 4 games in 2 days. So I started doing that. And then like they had tournaments like towards the end of the year, in November, in the one league, there was 2 different ones and there was like the Roy Hobbs. And then I can't remember the other name of the other baseball one, but they had what they called the Fall Classic. So it was kind of like where I played in Bradenton, they just didn't have enough people to put a team together. So the guy knew how it worked and he told me, and I wound up throwing my name in the hat for like 3 years. And I wound up playing for a team out of Pennsylvania. And it was a good group of guys and everything. It was a lot of fun playing. So they would put you in different, categories, and it was kind of like playing in a World Series. And you played in like all the different spring training fields. So you were in like, in St. Pete, Dunedin and stuff like that. So you played in their spring training stuff. And then when I was coaching, and like I said, the kids that I had coached were like telling me about ECW, and that's when I started taping that. And it was funny because I watched that Mike Awesome match with Tanaka, and as he threw him into a table, into the guardrail, my wife goes, "Aren't you glad you're not there?" And I'm like, "No, this is great. This is, that was, like, wow. I wouldn't mind going back and trying to get into ECW, so that's right. So that's when, but it was same thing. I did the match with Rick and it was like, man, I got to get a ring, I got to get ring time because I got too much rust.
Right. Talk to me about your personal life while you were wrestling, Florida, WCW. How was your personal life? You were known as Robbie Idol, but when Robbie Idol wasn't in the ring, who was Robbie Idol outside of the ring and when you wasn't on the road?
It was, let's put it that way, again, like in the book. So, we're kind of exposing some stuff, but okay. To answer your questions. So it talks about like in the beginning, you read in the beginning, like everybody else, I wanted fame. I wanted fame more than fortune. It was funny. I had buddies in high school that, like we were just the middle-class kids, like, those awkward guys or whatever. And like my buddies would go, "Oh, I wished we were popular." And I would look at them and go, "Why?" And they go, "So we get invited to parties and stuff." And I would just, I thought, you know, you guys are looking at this little picture here, you know, it's like, because I, like, again, go back to, I thought I'd play pro ball. I thought I'd be famous. And I was like, people will know who I am, you know? So once, like with the bodybuilding and lifting weights and stuff, now you're, you know, you're not that little skinny, awkward guy. So personal life, I guess I turned into what you kind of want it to be, you know, like that, you know, you were popular. Like I lived with 3 other roommates. Those guys, I mean, all 4 of us were all heavy drinkers. 2 of them were big time partiers. Like one of my roommates, he actually had a scholarship for swimming at LSU. So I'm not sure how many, you know, like the difference in age in us, but there was a guy, I don't remember the name of the swimmer. If I knew it, you would know him because he went to the Olympics. My roommate he at LSU would kick his ass in practices and stuff. But my roommate, unfortunately, was more into partying than, you know, and the practice could have went to the Olympics. He would beat this guy. Can't remember his name, who it was. So we were, you know, you were partiers. You just, you know, what was funny was like when I was home. So 99% of the time when we went out, it was all 4 of us. So what was funny about it, like us being, you know, always being out together and stuff, a lot of the, like, I guess the girls and stuff, certain girls, like, they knew I wrestled. I had a roommate that was the assistant manager at ABC. You know, he was very popular. So like when you'd go to bars and stuff, you know, between the bartenders, when, you know, you'd get drinks and stuff like that. So what was funny though, is a lot of the girls started naming us the 4 horsemen. Because so what was, you know, and then you kind of got wind of it and you thought it was cool, you know, you're like, okay, you know, can't do it in wrestling, might as well, you know, be here. Right. And that was, and like, cause on the indie circuit with like wrestling for Rick, I wrestled for Jerry Gray in a couple other places. You kind of thought, okay, you were a bigger star than what you really were. And you could see it at a little bit in time, and even like some of the indie, like there was Suncoast Wrestling and stuff. The personality, like usually I'm like that. I'm easygoing, try to get along with everybody. Try not to, you know, be that guy that causes, you know, be the asshole or whatever. But you could see that some of that's, you know, like, even though it wasn't WCW, it was on the indie circuit, that you were, you know, getting to have that, some of the, you know, the stardom that you had, you started to be a little bit of that asshole person and stuff like that. But it was at home for a lot of years. It was, you know, that you partied, you know, with different people. You never kept, if you had a relationship, you never kept it, you know, it was like different, you were with different people, you know, it was just like what everybody thinks, you know, it was, you were that person, you know, like if you weren't in a relationship and you went into a bar, you knew you were leaving with somebody, you know, it was just what it was. And then, you know, eventually it just, you know, you kind of you know, you got into a relationship and it kind of calmed you down and stuff like that. But that for a while, you know, it was what you know, what you wanted to be, you know, wasn't the great person that you should have been, but, you know, hey, it was fun while it lasted, you know? Yeah. So.
Right. Well, I tell you what, fans, I know this is a weird place to end a podcast, but we're going to end it here because we have part 2 that's going to be coming up in a couple of weeks. We're going to really take a deep dive into his book. Again, it is Looking Up at the Lights. I implore you to go get this book and then watch the podcast after you guys read the book, so you can follow along.
Can I?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. And it's on Kindle now. It did make it to Kindle, and we're waiting for I guess it's in review for Amazon, so we're just waiting for that approval from there. But it is on Kindle though, and also the publisher who had published it is Lulu.com. So if you go to the bookstore for Lulu.com, it's kind of hard to find. So if you put Robbie Idol looking up at the lights in Lulu.com in the bookstore, it'll bring up like I think they're kids' books. So you got to scroll down a little bit to where it says explicit because of some of the language in the book. And that's where you'll click and it will take you to the book then. And if you go to Lulu bookstore, but it's also now it is on Kindle. So,
okay. And I'm going to put all that information into the description of this podcast, edited, because I am excited to finish reading the book and to have you back on to discuss the book, because there's a lot of stuff that we didn't even cover yet. Right. I asked you maybe 3 questions over the questions that I prepared, which is a good thing. That means our conversations went well. The fans, stay tuned. I will be announcing part 2 when it's going to be on. Probably later on tonight. After we get off this podcast, I'll have Rob and I will get a date. Man, you are great, very interesting.
Well, thank you. I greatly appreciate it. You were very fun, great guy. I appreciate you having me on. I thank you very much. You ever get to Florida, I owe you a dinner.
I tell you what, my wife and I, so this trip we just took is kind of the beginning of us traveling a lot. Our kids are pretty much moved on. Right. We're about to be empty nesters. My youngest is going to be in high school next year. So we're actually buying a RV trailer, hooking up to my truck, and starting next year. We're going to be traveling. We will be in Florida. So cool. Absolutely have lunch or dinner. Absolutely. Guys, please subscribe to the podcast. Again, I'm going to have Rob back on in a couple of weeks. Rob, I am looking forward to part 2 and to getting more into the book and the things that you wrote within the book. I really am. Again, guys, please subscribe to this podcast. I have some great guests that's going to be coming on. We're going to be doing our recaps of Monday Night Raw, and as well SmackDown and AEW Dynamite starting again on Thursday. On Thursdays, what we're going to do is after we do the recap of AEW Wednesday Night Dynamite, we're actually going to be talking about different historical events in professional wrestling. We're going to be starting off with talking about Halloween Havoc. It is October. What better thing to talk about than Halloween Havoc, that pay-per-view that started with WCW. So join us for that, guys. And until then, you guys have a great week. Rob, thank you again so much, and I'm looking forward to you coming back on.
Thank you. I'm looking forward to it.
You guys have a great night.